missile strike hit Odessa, reportedly killing 5 people and wounding several. Further drone attacks were reported last night. On Saturday, 2 March, 12 people were reportedly killed in a drone attack on an apartment block. 5 of those killed were children, making it the deadliest incident for children in more than 9 months. This heartbreaking incident followed 2 consecutive nights of drone attacks on 22nd and 23rd February that claimed the lives of 4 people. Since February 2022, Odessa, an important hub for Ukrainian agricultural exports, has also suffered repeated strikes on its infrastructure. The cultural heritage sites on the city have not been spared. Odessa is far from being the only Ukrainian city under constant fire. In recent days, civilian casualties have been reported in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Sumy, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine. Last night, 2 people were reportedly killed as a result of missile attacks on the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Yesterday afternoon, a reported Russian missile strike on the city of Sumy injured 1 civilian, damaged the central city hospital and the region's emergency medical center. These are only a few of the recent incidents. We are particularly concerned by the reports that the fighting is spreading to new residential areas in the east of Ukraine. Throughout this war, fighting that came to Ukrainian villages, towns, and cities led to complete or near-complete destruction at the hands of Russian forces. This has been witnessed in Mariupol, Bakhmut, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Volvonakha, and most recently in Adviivka. This horrific pattern must not be perpetuated. According to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine has already resulted in the death of 10,703 civilians, including 594 children. 20,146 more, including 1,316 children, have been injured. We condemn all attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. They are prohibited under international law. They are unacceptable and must stop now. Mr. President, the Secretary General has emphasized in his recent remarks to this Council that territorial integrity and political independence of states are fundamental principles of the UN Charter. They are at the heart of our multilateral order. Therefore, the reports of the Russian Federation's plan to organize and hold its March presidential elections in the territories of Ukraine currently under its control are deeply disturbing. The attended illegal annexations of Ukrainian territory have no validity under international law, as also declared by the UN General Assembly. The United Nations remain fully committed to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, today is International Women's Day. I wish to pay tribute to the courageous Ukrainian women and girls who, despite the unspeakable horrors they have endured, continue to work to support their communities and to build a better future for their country. Yet, economic turmoil caused by the war is disproportionately affecting Ukrainian women's livelihood. Their well-being is at risk due to restricted access to essential services. They face heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We continue to work to ensure that the needs of women and girls are addressed in our efforts to mitigate the impacts of the war. We are also committed to partnering with Ukrainian women leaders and women peace and security champions to promote women's full and equal participation in decision-making, recovery, and peace efforts. Mr. President, the past 2 years of war have come with a heavy price for Ukraine, Europe, and the world. We must now not allow for this war to bring further loss of life, destruction, and suffering. In the Secretary General's words, I quote, "It is high time for peace, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolution," end quote. The United Nations remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 years and 13 days have now passed since the full-scale escalation of this war. The latest wave of escalatory attacks in Odessa, Kharkiv, Sumy, Donetsk regions over the past few days shows how the conflict continues to inflict immeasurable human suffering, death, and devastation on the people of Ukraine. We were particularly appalled by the strike on the high-rise residential building in Odessa City this past weekend that, according to local authorities, killed 12 civilians, including 5 children. The recent attacks have left many other civilians without electricity, heat, and water. Multi-story apartment buildings have been damaged or destroyed by the impact of the strikes in cities and towns in Donetsk, Kherson, and Dnipro regions, rendering thousands homeless and in need of humanitarian assistance. Amid still cold winter temperatures, this damage is threatening the lives of the most vulnerable in particular, among them the elderly and those with disabilities. Many of these people have had to remain in frontline communities and are already suffering because of the disruption to essential services caused by the war. The UN Human Rights Office reports that nearly 31,000 civilians have now been killed or injured since 24 February 2022. This prompts me to repeat that attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Indiscriminate attacks are also strictly prohibited. Parties to the conflict must take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects, including infrastructure essential for civilian survival. On this International Women's Day, while we celebrate Ukrainian women as instrumental agents of change and honor the incredible work of Ukrainian women's organizations, we should also note the particularly harsh impact of the conflict on women and girls in Ukraine. The UN Population Fund reports a third of households led by women in Ukraine are struggling to feed themselves, and 60% of older women are unable to provide for their own basic needs. An increase in gender-based violence against women and girls has been a shocking hallmark of this war. Tragically, a lack of sufficient resources to sustain and expand a network of medical and social care services means that many of the 2.5 million people at risk of being subjected to gender-based violence in the coming year, notably acute for displaced women and girls near the front lines, will not have access to the services they need and deserve. Mr. President, the UN and its partners continue to do everything we can to provide humanitarian assistance to millions of people across Ukraine. This is in spite of the ongoing and deteriorating security situation. So far in 2024, 2 humanitarian workers have lost their lives and 10 have been injured, highlighting the dangers of delivering aid close to the front line. We're grateful to the donors who've so far provided 11% of the $3.1 billion needed for the 2024 Ukraine Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This has enabled us to address the ongoing impacts of the conflict and provide life-saving assistance. But more financial support is urgently needed to sustain operations. In recent months, humanitarians have provided more than 1.7 million people with some form of direct winter assistance, including winter heating, repair and maintenance of energy and heating systems, and much-needed home repair materials. The commitment and endurance shown by some 600 partner organizations delivering a humanitarian response across Ukraine is remarkable. They are working in the middle of tremendous insecurity and danger to provide civilians with the services and supplies they need to see them through the harsh winter and beyond. So far in 2024, the UN and its partners have had to adapt their operations to stay and deliver to the people affected by the intensification of fighting along the front line, delivering critical supplies to the nearly 13,000 war-affected residents in the frontline communities through 11 interagency convoys. These convoys are a lifeline. Just last week, 2 much-needed interagency convoys reached communities in Kherson and Donetsk that have been heavily impacted by months of fighting. They delivered portable power stations, hygiene items, and other essential supplies. This interagency support is complemented by numerous deliveries from local organizations and volunteers. But, Mr. President, we continue to face significant obstacles to reaching everyone in need. One of the most significant challenges remains the lack of humanitarian access to the parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts occupied by the Russian Federation. As hostilities continue to escalate, we're deeply concerned about the fate of the civilians in these territories whom we're unable to reach at scale. The consequences for an estimated 1.5 million people in need of life-saving assistance are unthinkable, and they are unavoidable. They are avoidable. As we have been stating repeatedly, under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure that humanitarian personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. This applies where civilians in need are located in Ukraine. Mr. President, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners remain committed to safeguarding the life and dignity of the people affected by this war for as long as it takes. But it has gone on far too long. It's time to bring the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people to an end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie M. Chiari et Mme Doughton pour leurs exposés. Mercredi, des missiles russes ont frappé la ville d'Odessa, causant la mort de 5 personnes. Certains de ces missiles se sont abattus à quelques centaines de mètres du convoi qui transportait le président ukrainien et le Premier ministre grec, alors en déplacement dans cette ville. Samedi dernier, des attaques de drones contre un immeuble d'habitation avaient tué 12 personnes, dont 5 enfants, et en avaient blessé 20 autres. Les autorités russes continuent de bafouer le droit international humanitaire dans la poursuite de la guerre d'agression illégale qu'elles mènent depuis plus de 2 ans contre l'Ukraine. Le bilan de cette guerre est désastreux et continue de s'alourdir. On dénombre 10 500 civils tués depuis le début du conflit et le nombre réel est sans doute bien plus élevé. Les frappes conduites par la Russie contre les infrastructures énergétiques ukrainiennes au cœur de l'hiver ont privé des centaines de villes et de villages d'électricité. Plus de 4 millions de personnes, dont 1 million d'enfants, ont été déplacées et plus de 17 millions ont besoin d'assistance humanitaire. La France est mobilisée pour répondre aux besoins. Elle a engagé près de 300 millions d'euros d'aide depuis le début du conflit. Elle a organisé plus de 50 opérations pour acheminer plusieurs milliers de tonnes de frais. Le droit international humanitaire interdit les frappes contre les populations et infrastructures civiles qui ne participent pas aux hostilités. La France condamne ces violations du droit international humanitaire et elle exige que les auteurs soient punis. La commission d'enquête indépendante du Conseil des droits de l'homme a dénoncé les attaques indiscriminées contre les populations et les infrastructures essentielles de l'Ukraine. La Cour pénale internationale a émis le 5 mars des mandats d'arrêt contre Sergueï Kobilak et Viktor Sokolov, qui sont accusés de crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité. Monsieur le Président, cette guerre cause des souffrances bien au-delà des frontières de l'Ukraine. Lorsque la Russie frappe les infrastructures de stockage et d'exportation de céréales, elle provoque une insécurité alimentaire qui pèse sur les populations vulnérables du monde entier, notamment des pays en développement. Pour répondre à cela, la France continuera de soutenir les initiatives visant à permettre les exportations de céréales ukrainiennes, comme les corridors de solidarité ou l'initiative Grain from Ukraine. Monsieur le Président, après plus de 2 ans d'agression, la Russie mise sur l'épuisement du peuple ukrainien et sur la lassitude de ceux qui le soutiennent. Elle n'y parviendra pas. Nous continuerons d'apporter un soutien politique, militaire et humanitaire à l'Ukraine pour l'aider dans l'exercice de son droit à la légitime défense. Nous continuerons d'appeler la Russie à retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien, comme l'a demandé la Cour internationale de justice dès le 16 mars 2022. Nous resterons mobilisés pour faire respecter les principes de la Charte des Nations Unies qui peuvent seuls, ici comme ailleurs, servir de base pour une paix juste et durable. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco la exposición informativa del subsecretario Haller Hiari y de la directora de la OCHA, Lisa Dochten. Reconozco la presencia en esta sala de los representantes de Ucrania, Grecia, Polonia, Letonia y la Unión Europea. Es lamentable que a pesar de nuestros esfuerzos colectivos, el Consejo deba reunirse una vez más para escuchar sobre los efectos devastadores de un conflicto que continúa despreciando la vida humana y el derecho internacional humanitario. Ha sido lamentable conocer sobre el reciente ataque ocurrido el 6 de marzo en Odessa, donde un golpe dirigido a la infraestructura portuaria resultó además en la trágica muerte de al menos 5 vidas civiles. La coincidencia del ataque con la visita del primer ministro griego, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, subraya la imprudencia con la que se desafían las normas internacionales y se debilita la diplomacia. Este hecho merece nuestro más enérgico rechazo. Este incidente representa además un golpe a las arterias vitales de una ciudad que desempeña un papel crucial para la economía de Ucrania y la región. Atacar infraestructuras críticas, además de ser una violación directa del derecho internacional, tiene un efecto dominó que afecta a personas inocentes, exacerbando la crisis humanitaria y poniendo en peligro la seguridad alimentaria mundial. El Ecuador reitera su llamado urgente a que cesen los ataques contra la población y contra la infraestructura civil e insiste en la responsabilidad de las partes de respetar irrestrictamente sus obligaciones que derivan del derecho internacional humanitario, incluyendo los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución. El continuo derramamiento de sangre y la destrucción que este conflicto causa no solo afecta a la población civil en Ucrania y en Rusia, sino que eleva el riesgo de una escalada mayor del conflicto, con posibles repercusiones que amenazan gravemente la seguridad global. Cada acto de violencia, cada declaración inflamatoria, cada ataque a la infraestructura civil y cada vida perdida nos acercan peligrosamente a un punto de no retorno, en el que las posibilidades de una solución pacífica se desvanecen. La historia nos ha enseñado una y otra vez que los conflictos armados no tienen ganadores. La única vía hacia una resolución duradera es a través de la mesa de negociaciones y de la diplomacia. Reiteramos el llamado a la Federación Rusa a que ponga fin a sus operaciones militares en Ucrania, tal como lo dispuso la Corte Internacional de Justicia en marzo del 2022. El mundo cuenta con nuestra capacidad para superar los conflictos. Deben utilizarse todos los medios disponibles para avanzar hacia una paz justa y duradera sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, I also thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Director Doughton for their briefings. Mr. President, the United States condemns in the strongest terms the Russian aerial assaults on cities and critical infrastructure across Ukraine. On March 6, Russia's strikes against the port city of Odessa were another stark reminder of how Russia is unleashing daily destructive attacks against Ukraine's people and infrastructure. Unfortunately, attacks against Odessa are not new. Last weekend, reports indicated that Russian strikes hit a high-rise residential building leaving 12 dead and 20 injured. Among those killed were 5 children, one of whom was only 7 months old. Reports indicate that at least 5 civilians were killed on March 6. We mourn this tragic loss of life. Every civilian death in conflict, no matter where in the world it occurs, is a tragedy. This time, when the air raid siren sounded, the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece were reviewing the profound devastation in Odessa as a result of months of sustained bombardment. Russia's strike hit a few hundred meters from their convoy. Mr. President, Russia's attempts to justify the unjustifiable today do not change simple facts: that Russia continues to conduct a war of aggression against another sovereign UN member state in violation of the Charter, that Ukraine would not need to call for urgent meetings of this Council if Russia would cease its aggression, that Ukrainian civilians are suffering daily death and destruction as a result of the Kremlin's attempts to conquer and subjugate their country. Mr. President, we must not forget that after Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, depriving some of the world's most food-insecure countries of Ukraine's grain, the Kremlin did not stop there. It launched more attacks on Odessa's ports, infrastructure, and grain storage. These attacks were not only cruel, they were part of a campaign to decimate Ukraine's economy after failing to defeat its military. In those strikes, Russia destroyed more than 300,000 tons of grain and vital storage facilities. Ukraine responded with resiliency and creativity, launching a humanitarian corridor that brought Ukraine's exports back to numbers not seen since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Russia is not only attacking food infrastructure, but also energy infrastructure. Earlier this week, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Sergei Kobylash, former commander of the long-range aviation of the Aerospace Force, and Viktor Sokolov, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in connection with Russia's attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. At every turn, the Kremlin chooses the path of war and escalation. It doubles down on nuclear saber-rattling and brazenly procures ballistic missiles and other munitions from the DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Colleagues, the United States will continue to stand with Ukraine and call for accountability. The path forward is clear. Russia must cease its attacks against Ukraine and immediately and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank ASG Chiari and Ms. Doughton for their briefing today. You see who we are dealing with. They don't care where to hit. Words spoken by the President of Ukraine on Wednesday, which could have been spoken on countless occasions during this war. We are compelled to gather again to respond to another appalling series of missile attacks on Ukraine. On the 2nd of March, 12 civilians, including 5 children, died when debris hit an apartment block in Odessa. One of the victims was a baby, only 4 months old. On the 6th of March, as President Zelensky and Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis paid their respects to the dead, a further Russian strike hit the city. While they narrowly escaped the impact, 5 others were not so lucky. President, we've met too often in this chamber to address the human suffering Russia has inflicted upon Ukraine. This week, it was attacks on residential buildings. In other weeks, it has been hospitals, schools, train stations, hotels, restaurants. Each time, It is innocent Ukrainian civilians who pay the price with their lives. The day before this latest strike, the International Criminal Court announced 2 new indictments of senior Russian military figures for an alleged campaign of strikes against Ukraine's electricity infrastructure. These are not the actions of a country that is interested in peace. Putin claims that he launched this war to protect Ukrainian civilians. In fact, he is terrorizing them. Russia's actions show an utter disregard for international law and the UN Charter. It is attempting to intimidate Ukraine, its people, and those who support Ukraine. It will not succeed. Russia's previous attacks on Odessa have utterly failed. Ukraine has now driven much of the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea and is exporting the highest volumes from its ports since the war began. As my Defence Secretary said in Kyiv yesterday, the UK's support remains unwavering, and we will provide an additional £325 million to help Ukraine defend itself. Ukrainians have shown that they will not be bullied into submission, and Russia should know that the UK stands proudly by their side. And so we repeat our call again to Russia. Withdraw your troops, cease the bloodshed and endless, senseless war. Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace that respects its territorial integrity. And with our support, that is what Ukraine will achieve. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Director Doughton for the briefings. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points in the name of my delegation. First, the city of Odessa remains one of the most besieged cities in the war on Ukraine. Russian aerial attacks increased dramatically since July last year after Russia stepped away from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The port city was subject to over 1,000 drone and missile attacks since then. These attacks are so regular, they have grown into events that are completely overseen by the international community. Air raid sirens turn on, drones or missiles appear, infrastructure gets reduced to rubble, and civilians buried underneath. At the end, sites of attacks are covered with flowers, candles, and toys. And the vicious cycle repeats itself the next day. So this has to stop. We cannot allow this to become the ordinary life for the inhabitants of Ukrainian cities such as Odessa. We cannot forget blatant violations of international law. We cannot tolerate indiscriminate use of high explosive weaponry in densely populated areas. Second, last Wednesday we have witnessed another low point of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In Odessa, a Russian missile landed a couple hundred meters away from leaders of 2 sovereign nations. While we are relieved that no harm was done to them, civilians died in the strike, and we are appalled by this, and we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. This represents another episode in this unnecessary war, where explosive weaponry is used indiscriminately in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. The Security Council needs to start fulfilling its primary responsibility and ensure prompt and effective action in order to bring back peace and security to Ukraine and wider region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we are grateful to Mr. Khaled Chiari, Assistant Secretary General, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director at WACHA, for their important and insightful briefings. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, the Council convened in this chamber to mark the 2-year milestone of this ongoing conflict. At the time, Mozambique raised deep concerns about the ominous escalation of the war, highlighting its severe economic, political, and humanitarian consequences. We advocated in our statement the need for a significant shift in our approach to finding a settlement by emphasizing the pivotal role of diplomacy. Regrettably, the recent spate of attacks has only served to push the prospect of detente even further away. Our apprehensions regarding the escalation of this conflict have been warranted lately. Clearly, the signals of escalatory attitudes will further undermine the security and stability in Europe and in the world. They will heighten the threat of retaliatory use of tactical nuclear weapons. We should not embrace positions that mark distance from the United Nations Charter that compel all members to settle international disputes by peaceful means, even in a situation of conflict. Mr. President, history, and recent history for that matter, has shown us that even in times of confrontation and a nuclear threat, there are opportunities for a strong leadership to avert the descent into further conflict, to thread back into the path of dialogue and peace. We need to resort to the constructive spirit that more than 30 years ago saw European countries committed to build on their continent a common house and a peaceful space. This spirit of cooperation and negotiation is critically needed today. Mozambique remains committed to advocating a diplomatic solution to end this war. We encourage that all avenues be explored, including the reestablishment of diplomatic channels, the exchange of prisoners, and the leveraging of the good offices of the Secretary General. We have always believed that genuine, constructive, and responsible dialogue is the correct path to resolving this conflict. In light of this, Mozambique reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We urge a return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of high priority. As the Secretary General eloquently stated in our last meeting, the problem has been a disregard for the charter that abhors the scourge of war. Honoring the letter and the spirit of the charter is the correct solution. It is therefore time to recommit ourselves to the charter and renew our respect for international law as the pathway to international peace and security. Today, 8th of March, International Women's Day, Mozambique wishes to pay tribute to women in the world, and particularly in those areas of conflict where women are working hand in hand with men for international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank ASG Kerry and Ms. Doughton for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine, European Union, Greece, Poland, and Latvia delegation at today's meeting. Ever since we solemnly commemorated the second anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion against Ukraine last month, we have witnessed Russia intensifying its missile and drone attacks against Ukraine cities. Such attacks are claiming civilian lives and inflicting damage on civilian infrastructures, such as residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and granaries. These include the deadly missile strike on Odessa, Ukraine's key port city, just 2 days ago, while the Prime Minister of Greece and the President of Ukraine were visiting. This extremely dangerous missile attack reportedly took place just a few hundred meters away from the 2 leaders' convoy. Regardless of the account that Russia provides, we cannot overlook the grave implication of this incident. By putting leaders in danger, these kinds of attacks unnecessarily lead to further escalation in the context of an already perilous regional situation. These unjustifiable wars' impacts have already created untold human suffering, in addition to various ripple effects at the global level. And we cannot afford any further spread of this conflict. It is alarming to see this war getting further protracted and escalated. Mr. President, my delegation believes that the international community's commitments to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity is unwavering. And this unwavering commitment has been reaffirmed here in the United Nations, as we vividly remember that an overwhelming majority of the General Assembly adopted a resolution on a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine last year. We reiterate that the only way to achieve this goal is for Russia to withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. The flagrant violations of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must cease immediately. Protracted conflict not only means immediate losses and damages. Prolonged and accumulated destruction and suffering will make recoveries even harder in the long term. In this context, we note the alarming estimation of the recent rapid damage and needs assessments jointly released by Ukraine, the World Bank Group, the European Commission, and the United Nations. The total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine amounts to $486 billion over the next decades, which is equivalent to the 2.5 times of Ukraine's current GDP. Through its own experience of the devastating consequences of the war, the Korean people are acutely aware of how tortuous and painstaking the course of reconstruction is. This is why the Republic of Korea is firmly committed to working with the international community to support reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. On the top of $140 million in humanitarian assistance already provided to Ukraine, we will deliver a comprehensive aid packages of $2.3 billion over the upcoming years to help the Ukrainian people rebuild their nation. My government is also actively participating in the multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine to better coordinate collective assistance among major donor countries. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari and Director Leeson Doughton for the updates provided. Guyana deeply regrets that civilian lives continue to be lost in this ongoing war in Ukraine. We deplore the recent attacks, including in the city of Odessa, which claimed the lives of several civilians, including young children, and caused widespread damage to civilian infrastructure. This war continues to inflict immeasurable suffering and destruction, with women and children bearing the brunt of the increasingly tense bombardments. OCHA has reported that the humanitarian situation in frontline communities, including the territories occupied by the Russian Federation, is reaching severe and catastrophic levels, with more than 3.3 million people, including 800,000 children, requiring emergency assistance. The organization has also documented the damage and destruction wrought during the past year, including of homes, hospitals, schools, and vital civilian infrastructure. These cannot be allowed to continue. Guyana reiterates its call for an end to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We urge the parties to the conflict to immediately cease all indiscriminate attacks and to take every measure possible to protect civilians. We further demand that they honor their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to guarantee protection for those who are most vulnerable. We further stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means and encourage the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and the continued engagement of the international community to this end. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its support for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And as we commemorate International Women's Day, we salute those women in Ukraine and Russia who are working for peace, and we express our solidarity with those who are grieving for their loved ones lost. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
诸位先生，首先要感谢加亚利助理秘书长和多腾女士的通报。乌克兰危机延宕至今，恶性袭击和平民伤亡事件时有发生，人道局势不断恶化。今天的通报再次说明了战争的残酷性和形势的严峻性，中方对此深感忧虑和痛心。冲突对抗没有赢家，任何冲突的终点都是谈判桌。早一点谈起来，和平就早一天到来。只要各方都遵守联合国宪章的宗旨和原则，妥善解决好彼此合理关切，欧洲就能真正建立起均衡、有效、可持续的安全框架。我们呼吁当事方保持冷静克制，加强直接接触和对话，逐步积累共识，共同探索可行的解决出路。国际社会也应加大外交努力，推动局势缓和降级，为政治解决创造条件。在乌克兰问题上，中方始终秉持客观公正立场，从未放弃劝和促谈努力。中国政府欧亚事务特别代表 正在访问俄罗斯、乌克兰以及有关的欧洲国家，就推动乌克兰危机的政治解决开展斡旋。中方支持适时召开俄乌双方认可、各方平等参与、对所有和平方案进行公平讨论的国际和会。我们愿继续同各方保持沟通接触，为停火止战凝聚共识，为对话和谈铺路架桥，为推动危机的政治解决做出不懈努力，发挥建设性作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le sous-secrétaire général Mohamed Khaled Triari et la directrice Lisa Dalton-Docha pour leurs exposés. Alors que nous sommes entrés dans la 3e année de l'agression militaire de la Russie contre l'Ukraine, la réunion d'aujourd'hui est un rappel de son impact dévastateur sur la population civile. La Suisse continue de déplorer le coût humain et les immenses souffrances causées par cette guerre. Chaque jour où les hostilités se poursuivent, le nombre de victimes civiles augmente, à l'instar des événements de la semaine écoulée. Nous sommes troublés par l'intensification des attaques de missiles et de drones russes au cours de ces derniers jours et des dernières semaines. En fin de semaine dernière, plusieurs régions de l'Est et du Sud de l'Ukraine, dont Donetsk, Mykolaïev et Kharkiv, ont été attaquées, faisant de nouvelles victimes et causant d'importants dégâts à des bâtiments résidentiels et à d'autres infrastructures civiles, dont un hôpital et des écoles. Les attaques perpétrées à Odessa samedi dernier, et il y a 2 jours, lors de la visite du président Zelensky et du Premier ministre Mitsotakis, ont été tragiques. Comme nous l'avons entendu, 12 personnes ont été tuées lors de la première attaque, dont plusieurs enfants. Il ne s'agit là que des derniers exemples d'attaques contre la ville qui a subi d'énormes dégâts après des mois de frappes russes, détruisant et endommageant plusieurs sites culturels importants, ainsi que des infrastructures portuaires et des silos à grains. Ceci nous rappelle à quel point cette guerre, au travers de son impact sur la sécurité alimentaire, a des conséquences délétères à travers le monde. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse condamne la nouvelle série d'attaques qui a fait de nombreuses victimes civiles. Ces attaques doivent cesser immédiatement. Nous réitérons notre appel au respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Le droit international humanitaire interdit les attaques contre les civils, y compris contre les enfants, qui doivent être protégés à tout moment. Nous réitérons l'importance de la lutte contre l'impunité pour les crimes les plus graves et soutenons les efforts nationaux, régionaux et internationaux en matière de responsabilité, y compris ceux de la Cour pénale internationale qui a récemment délivré des mandats d'arrêt supplémentaires pour crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité présumés. J'exprime également ma gratitude pour le travail des acteurs humanitaires qui ont réagi rapidement aux attaques, y compris dans la ville d'Odessa. Leur travail, qu'il s'agisse des premiers secours, du soutien psychologique ou de la distribution d'aide d'urgence, reste indispensable et doit être protégé. Enfin, la Suisse reste engagée en faveur d'une paix globale, juste et durable en Ukraine, conformément aux principes de la Charte de l'ONU. Dans l'intérêt de la protection de la population civile, une telle paix doit rester notre objectif principal. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank the briefers, ASG Khalid Kiai and Director Lisa Dottin, for the information provided. I welcome the presence of and participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Sierra Leone continues to express grave concern about the continuing regrettable situation created in Ukraine by the conflict, with its continuing serious ramifications for international peace and security. In all the meetings on this regrettable conflict, we will reiterate our call for the full respect of the United Nations Charter and the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and for the immediate cessation of the hostilities. In so doing, we urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, addressing the legitimate concerns of all parties to the conflict. Mr. President, Turning to recent incidents for which today's briefing has been convened, we take note of reports of missile strikes, including in the Black Sea port of Odessa, while the Greek Prime Minister, Kyrios Mitsotakis, and the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, were visiting, with tragic fatalities and damage to vital infrastructure. It is deeply concerning that instead of cessation of hostilities, we observe signals of a more dangerous escalation of the conflict. Given this serious situation, Sierra Leone is firmly of the view that time is now for the parties to the conflict and other involved parties to persist and commit to commencing meaningful constructive dialogue and seek a path to a peaceful resolution. There is need for a ceasefire initiative for the people of Ukraine and those affected in Russia. Furthermore, and regrettably, as the hostilities continue, we reiterate our call for the parties to comply with their obligations under international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected at all times. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine continues to have devastating consequences, not only for the parties to the conflict, but for the region and beyond. There are persistent, far-reaching effects on the global economy. On International Women's Day, we wish to highlight the growing cost of the conflict on women. According to UN Women, from heightened trafficking and gender-based violence to the loss of crucial livelihoods and rising poverty levels, women and girls of Ukraine are facing severe impacts. The large-scale destruction of infrastructure has left survivor service, healthcare, and other critical forms of support out of reach for many. Today, protecting civilians and providing humanitarian aid should remain an imperative. Human rights abuses, including reported allegations of sexual violence, must be investigated with accountability for the survivors. As women continue to bear different and additional burdens of conflict, they must be represented in all decision-making platforms on de-escalation, conflict prevention, mitigation, and other processes in pursuit of peace and security for all. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating a call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities, a ceasefire initiatives, and the parties to the conflict to engage constructively in good faith in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Сегодня весь мир отмечает большой праздник – Международный женский день. Как известно, в нашей стране еще со времен Советского Союза заложены прочные основы реального, а не декларативного равноправия и равных профессиональных возможностей для женщин. И как бы западные коллеги не пытались испортить этот день своими фейками про Россию, ради распространения которых они созвали это заседание, я хотел бы поздравить всех женщин в мире, включая коллег по Совету Безопасности, с праздником, пожелать им профессиональных успехов и благополучия. Вы не на словах, а на деле вносите вклад в поддержание международного мира и безопасности. Господин председатель, мы уже много раз на конкретных примерах доказывали, что высокоточные удары российских ВКС по объектам на Украине, связанным с военным потенциалом киевского режима, не несут опасности для не находящихся на них мирных жителей этой страны. Это прекрасно знают и простые украинцы, которые уже не раз могли убедиться в том, что их жизням угрожают исключительно действия непрофессиональной украинской системы ПВО, размещаемой, к тому же, в жилых кварталах украинских городов в нарушении норм МГП. Все мы помним, как сбившаяся с курса ракета ПВО разрушила Спасо-Преображенский собор в Одессе. От таких же заблудившихся ракет или от обломков страдали жилые дома в Киеве, Харькове, Днепропетровске, в той же Одессе, в других украинских городах. Повторюсь, простые украинцы об этом знают. Да и характер подобных разрушений, как вам подтвердит любой человек, маломальски разбирающийся в современных вооружениях, не позволяет предположить, что речь идет о прямом ракетном ударе. Однако представители киевского режима и их западные кукловоды с маниакальной и сложно объяснимой настойчивостью пытаются выдать последствия работы ПВО киевского режима за наши целенаправленные удары по гражданским объектам. На решение этой невыполнимой задачи направлено и наше сегодняшнее заседание. Уважаемые коллеги, в период со 2 по 8 марта вооруженными силами России действительно было нанесено 34 групповых удара высокоточным оружием, реактивными системами залпового огня и беспилотными летательными аппаратами по объектам на Украине, где осуществлялась сборка и подготовка для боевого применения безэкипажных катеров, арсеналом, базам топлива для военной техники, пунктом дислокации подразделений ВСУ, формирований националистов и иностранных наемников. Как подтверждают данные объективного контроля, а также свидетельствуют многочисленные публикации украинских пользователей в соцсетях, все намеченные цели были успешно поражены. На этих же кадрах, с которыми легко ознакомиться в интернете, прекрасно видно, как в результате беспорядочной стрельбы украинской ПВО из жилых кварталов ракеты и снаряды падают на те районы, обстрел которых не велся. Показательны также и комментарии пользователей под этими и другими публикациями с призывами бояться именно непредсказуемую ПВО, а не российские ракеты. Эта тема попадает даже в репортажи западных телеканалов, которым становится все сложнее скрывать правду о происходящем. Так, в ходе репортажа CNN из ожидающего освобождения города Часов Яр прозвучало следующее эмоциональное признание одной из его жительниц. Цитирую. «Украинские военные забирают всю воду, подъезжают прямо к домам, где живут мирные жители, и стреляют прямо из дома. Они прячутся за спинами мирных». Конец цитаты. Из этого же репортажа становится понятно, что остающиеся в Часовом Яре жители с нетерпением ждут российских войск. И это понятно. Ситуация, когда подразделения укронацистов прикрываются мирными жителями как живым щитом, заставляет переосмыслить ценности даже самых убежденных сторонников режима Зеленского. Однако слепыми и глухими к этим сигналам остаются наши западные коллеги, пока еще не теряющие надежду на то, что воюющий за их интересы киевский режим сможет противостоять армии России. Правда, ставки уже сильно понижены, и вместо призывов помочь победить Украине мы все чаще слышим заклинания о том, что нельзя допустить победы России. Однако в условиях, когда инициатива на фронте полностью перешла к российской армии, вопрос состоит лишь в том, что готовы предпринять западные спонсоры Зеленского и его клики, чтобы попытаться спасти свой геополитический проект по созданию антироссии на наших границах от полного коллапса. Поставок оружия тут явно недостаточно. Как выяснилось за последние дни, хваленые американские «Абрамсы» горят не хуже разрекламированных немецких «Леопардов». Примерно так же, как в степях Украины 80 лет назад горели их предшественники, немецкие «Тигры» и «Пантеры». Совершенно очевидно, что никакие новые поставки оружия на Украину агонию обанкротившегося киевского режима не остановят. Они могут лишь растянуть ее по времени ценой жизни десятков, если не сотен тысяч украинцев. Тех самых, которых киевская власть сейчас всеми способами отлавливает на улице и бросает в бессмысленную мясорубку. Ведь на кону выживание режима Зеленского и престиж тех, кто стоял за антиконституционным переворотом в Киеве 10 лет назад. Подобная перспектива, судя по всему, вызывает у ряда безответственных европейских политиков желание добиваться эскалации украинского конфликта, выведения его на новый уровень, уже не опосредованного, а прямого столкновения России и НАТО. Сложно толковать иначе позицию французского президента Макрона о необходимости введения войск Альянса на Украину для предотвращения краха киевского режима. Жаль, что мы ничего не услышали об этих задумках, грозящих началом Третьей мировой войны, в выступлении представителя Франции. Жаль также, что мы не видим среди запросившихся выступить на сегодняшнем заседании обычно весьма активного представителя Германии. Было бы интересно услышать ее комментарии в связи с утекшим в СМИ разговором высокопоставленных немецких военных, рассуждавших о том, как помочь украинцам разрушить Керченский мост в Крым и наносить удары вглубь территории России. В ходе этого же разговора мы услышали подтверждение того, что американские, британские и европейские военные советники непосредственно находятся на Украине и помогают ВСУ выбирать цели для ударов. То есть подтвердилось то, о чем мы давно говорили. Каждое использование западного дальнобойного оружия против мирного населения делает его поставщиков соучастниками этих нарушающих МГП преступлений Зеленского и его клики. Благодаря расследованию «Нью-Йорк Таймс» мы также узнали, что проект «Украина» является крупнейшей операцией ЦРУ в истории, начавшейся задолго до 2014 года, а также о том, что сразу после госпереворота на российской границе появились мощнейшие разведывательные станции ЦРУ. Жаль, что в своем выступлении представитель США поскромничал и ничего нам об этом не рассказал. Да и в целом было бы неплохо, если бы натовские представители в Совбезе разъяснили нам лукавую логику Альянса. Сначала его лидеры говорили нам о том, что НАТО должна расшириться на Украину, потому что Россия не станет нападать на страну-члена НАТО. Сегодня же мы слышим, что нельзя дать России одержать победу на Украине, потому что после этого она двинется дальше и нападет на НАТО. Где хоть какой-то здравый смысл в ваших высказываниях, господа, и хоть какая-то последовательность? Впрочем, она красноречиво проявляется в том, как вы лепите из России образ врага и агрессора, опуская факты о том, что ваша агрессия против России за действием Украины началась как минимум 10 лет назад. Обо всех этих нелицеприятных для наших западных коллег моментах мы подробно поговорим на запрошенном нами на 22 марта отдельном заседании Совета Безопасности. Господин председатель, как гласит известная турецкая пословица, когда клоун переезжает жить во дворец, он не становится королем. Зато дворец становится цирком. Можно было бы, конечно, воспринимать все происходящее на Украине как цирк, если бы последствия не были столь трагичными и катастрофическими для этого государства. Но цирковые номера в нем все-таки весьма популярны. Все мы знаем о воздушных сиренах, звучащих в Киеве и других городах во время визитов высокопоставленных зарубежных делегаций в отсутствие каких-либо обстрелов. Это уже стало своего рода частью цирковой программы пребывания иностранных лидеров на Украине. Что примечательно, в Одессе, по военным объектам которой действительно наносился удар во время приезда в этот город высокопоставленной греческой делегации, сирена не прозвучала. Такого номера в цирковой программе не значилось. Хочу призвать всех тех, кто сегодня нагнетал и еще будет нагнетать страсти из-за этого эпизода, задать себе простой вопрос. Неужели вы и правда думаете, что если бы мы действительно хотели попасть по кортежу Зеленского, мы бы этого не смогли сделать? И постарайтесь на него ответить только честно. Особенно с учетом того, что вы прекрасно знаете о том, что этим ударом был уничтожен цех по производству морских беспилотников, а точнее их сборки из поставляемых Великобритании компонентов. Для нас эта цель гораздо важнее, чем мечущийся по прифронтовой зоне Зеленский, делающий селфи в городах перед тем, как их освобождает российская армия. А если кто-то из вас в душе надеется избавиться таким образом от главаря киевского режима, то могу вас разочаровать. В наши планы это не входит. Реинкарнацию господина Голобородька из сериала «Слуга народа» избрали на президентство украинцы, поверив его предвыборным обещаниям об установлении мира на Донбассе и защите русского языка и русскоговорящих граждан Украины. Он своих избирателей обманул. Вот пусть теперь с ним разбираются украинцы и его западные кукловоды. У нас есть задача поважнее – выполнение целей нашей специальной военной операции. И поскольку разговаривать о том, как их реализовать мирными средствами, вы не хотите, мы вынуждены использовать для этого средства военные, со всеми вытекающими последствиями для Украины и западных спонсоров киевского режима, которые уже начали весьма отчетливо проступать. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank ASG Kari and Ms. Doughton for their important briefings, and I welcome the participation of the Ukrainian PR in our meeting today. On 6 March, the official delegations of Ukraine and Greece, headed by the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece, respectively visited the Ukrainian city of Odessa. Talks were aimed to discuss assistance in restoring civilian infrastructure. These include churches, educational institutions, and cultural heritage sites in Ukraine that were damaged or destroyed in Russia's war of aggression. While this visit was taking place, the city was attacked with deadly explosives, including in the nearby port facility. Repeatedly, Russian forces showed indifference as to whether targets were military or civilian. Since last week, we have seen a significant escalation in violence in Ukraine. Russian forces have increased their brutal attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the port city of Odessa, destroying residential buildings and damaging other essential facilities. Sadly, 12 citizens, including 5 children, were killed in an attack on 2nd March. Further civilian casualties due to Russia's aerial attacks were also reported in the Kherson and Donetsk regions. We underscore once again that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. They are unacceptable and must stop immediately. The civilian population has suffered immensely during this brutal war and must be protected by all means. These actions against civilians are deeply troubling and unacceptable. Malta strongly condemns these continuous heinous attacks, and we express our deepest condolences to the families of the victims. Let us be clear. The persistent nature of these attacks and the escalating violence resulting in civilian casualties demonstrates Russia's total lack of commitment to peace, its disdain for international law, and its complete disregard for human life. Russia's aggression has entered its 3rd year, and unfortunately we are no closer to the end of this illegal, unjustified and unprovoked war. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 18,500 injured. With each passing day, the damage and humanitarian consequences this conflict is causing to Ukraine, as well as to the international security, becomes increasingly evident. Malta will continue to seek justice and full accountability for all crimes committed in connection with Russia's war against Ukraine, including for the crime of aggression. Malta fully supports the important work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine in their investigation efforts. We must restore international peace and security to shape a better future for our children. In closing, President, Malta reiterates that the only step towards a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank ASD Khaled Khiari and Director Lisa Doughton for their insightful briefings. We are meeting urgently today to discuss yet another series of attacks that have reportedly caused casualties among civilians in Ukraine. I could imagine how horrific it is to feel endangered and unsafe. But I couldn't imagine how civilians can feel when their security is continuously under threat. This is, unfortunately, a situation that many civilians are living every single day in both sides of the borders. And no prospects for peace are foreseen so far. This should remind us all how urgent and critical are the de-escalation of tensions and the cessation of hostilities. This should also prompt parties to favor a peaceful settlement of this crisis. This should also encourage them to engage in an inclusive and constructive dialogue with the unique aim of reaching a just and lasting political solution. A solution that must be guided by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of the parties. This should also increase our determination to intensify diplomatic effort towards a peaceful settlement of this dispute. We once again call on the parties to privilege the path of peace and dialogue. Escalation, polarizations, and confrontation are only leading to more tensions, more destruction, and most importantly, a higher death toll, especially among civilians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Japan. I also thank ASG Hihari and Director Doughton for their briefings. Just 2 weeks ago, in this chamber, we once again condemned Russia for its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, which has persisted now for 2 years in flagrant violation of the UN Charter and continue on the very day of International Women's Day, having women and girls in Ukraine suffer. Russia, as usual, attempted today to justify the unjustifiable, but the international community remains unconvinced by such excuses. Russia's relentless attacks on Odessa continue, resulting in civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure. We learned the President of Ukraine and Prime Minister of Greece narrowly escaped, but the citizens in that area were victimized. Today, we heard the detailed briefings from the briefers regarding the grim reality of death and destruction wrought by Russia's actions. Given such countless atrocities, who on earth can believe that Russia is seeking peace? We reiterate our commitment to the principle that peace in Ukraine must be based on UN Charter, as demanded by the General Assembly. We must confront those who continue to launch drones and missiles at civilians. We must uphold the UN Charter and the rule of law, and we must hold those responsible accountable under international law without any impunity. Once again, we urge Russia to stop its ongoing aggression and immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its troops and military equipment from the entire international recognized territory of Ukraine. Our unwavering commitment remains steadfast in supporting Ukraine, which is valiantly defending its people, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in accordance with the UN Charter. Our government, together with the Japanese private sector, will continue to support Ukraine and its resilient reconstruction. Japan has been with Ukraine and will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General Chiari, Director Dutton. I also have to recognize the team, the women team of the Russian Federation on this International Women's Day. And I reckon while the Russian women continue to work, the Russian male representative reiterated to heavily engage in the celebration of the Women's Day, in a particular Moscow's anti-agenda way, with something stronger than a bubbly. And of course, with the exception of the Russian men who keep today killing Ukrainian women and girls. As a representative of an original UN member, I can state that the nearly 33 years of Russia's presence in this organization has been a history of territorial seizures, wars, and aggression in neighboring countries and on other continents. Neither the Security Council nor the General Assembly ever considered the letter of the then Russian President Yeltsin, dated December 24, 1991, on their desire to continue the Soviet membership, nor did they ever vote on this matter. Now we see again that Russia perceives the occupation of the Soviet seat as indulgence for violations and crimes. It keeps terrorizing Ukrainians by attacking civilian infrastructure and residential areas with missiles, drones, guided aerial bombs, and various artillery weapons. Over the past week alone, from February 26 till March 3rd, Russian forces used approximately 400 guided aerial bombs, over 50 Shahed drones, and more than 40 missiles against Ukrainian cities and villages. In the city of Odessa has been a particular target, enduring almost daily shelling. The most tragic consequences were registered following the nighttime drone attack on Odessa on March the 2nd. One of the drones hit a high-rise residential building, destroying 18 apartments. 12 residents, including 5 children, were killed while sleeping peacefully in their beds. 8 other residents of the targeted building were wounded. It is important to note that injuries caused by missiles and drones are often severe and difficult to recover from. The actual number of casualties following Russian airstrikes could be higher than reported immediately after the conclusion of rescue operations. For instance, the day after the above drone attack on March 3rd, a victim of another Russian act of terror in Odessa, a 61-year-old woman, succumbed to severe injuries sustained 10 days earlier during the Russian strike on February 23rd. The bloody murder of children in Odessa on March 2nd did not stop, but rather encouraged Russians to intensify their attacks. During the night of March the 5th, the Russian drone attack on Odessa region lasted for 3 hours. The Ukrainian air defense managed to intercept 18 drones. On the following night, March the 6th, Odessa was attacked by 22 drones. 18 of them were shot down by our forces. However, the remaining 4 damaged civilian infrastructure in total. Overnight, the Russians launched 42 Shahed drones and fired 5 S-300 missiles, attacking not only Odessa, but also Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Khmelnytsky, Cherkasy, Kharkiv, Vinnytsia, and Sumy regions. Later, on March the 6th, the Russian forces launched missile attacks on the Odessa port. During the strike, the city was hosting the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece, who were in close proximity as one of the missiles detonated approximately several hundred meters away from the official delegations. Unfortunately, 5 people were killed and another 5 were wounded on the territory of the port as a result of the above strike. On March the 7th, a missile attack was again carried out in Odessa on the territory of the second berth of the port. 5 people were killed and 7 injured. The destruction and damage of 4 buildings were also registered. Mr. President, it is evident that by choosing Odessa as one of the main targets for their airstrikes, the Russian aggressors try to disrupt the functioning of the maritime corridor established by the Ukrainian naval forces after Russia undermined the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Russia failed in its attempts to blackmail the international community by withdrawing from the initiative. However, Ukraine is steadfast in its commitment to ensuring global food security despite the ongoing war, and has launched the maritime corridor and continues to develop its efficacy. Since August 2023, almost 30 million tons of cargo have been exported to 42 countries across the globe from the ports of Odessa, Pivdenny, and Chernomorsk. Of this amount, more than 8 million tons were exported in February alone. 80% of these shipments continue our agriculture exports. In fact, exports from the Ukrainian Black Sea ports have reached levels comparable to those before the full-scale invasion. The steadily diminishing Russian Black Sea fleet no longer dares to appear in the northwestern part of the Black Sea, let alone to consider the possibility of a blockade of Ukrainian ports. All that remains for Russia is to launch missiles in an attempt to intimidate Ukraine and our trade partners. Therefore, enhancing air defense capabilities will expedite ship loading time and provide better protection for the ports. According to expert assessments, modernization of the relevant infrastructure, coupled with proper security conditions, would allow volumes to be increased by at least a quarter, thus further reducing the threat of food insecurity. Together with international insurance companies, Ukraine implements projects aimed at reducing the cost of war risk insurance for exporters of all Ukrainian products. In January, the first vessel insured against war risks headed for loading in the ports of Odessa region. The cost of insurance for this vessel was much lower than during the grain initiative period. Mr. President, the humanitarian consequences of the Russian war against Ukraine continue escalating with each passing day of the aggression. To date, the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies have launched investigations into 143,508 war crimes and 16,650 crimes against national security. They include the killing of 11,973 civilians, including 534 children, and the wounding of more than 19,200 civilians, including more than 1,200 children. These figures do not take into account the temporarily occupied areas. Russia not only inflicts deliberate harm upon civilians, attacking critical civilian infrastructure, schools and hospitals in Ukraine, but also continues its abhorrent practice of abducting Ukrainian children. To date, Ukrainian authorities have identified 19,546 children who have been deported to the Russian Federation. So far, only 388 of them have been successfully returned and reunited with their families. Separately, it has also been possible to return dozens of children from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. One of the most pressing challenges is the release of illegally detained Ukrainian civilians. According to the Ukrainian ombudsperson, over 28,000 civilian Ukrainians are held incommunicado in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine or in Russia, enduring inhumane conditions. Russia must be brought to justice for civilian infrastructure facilities damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. Their number, as registered by Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, has exceeded 151,000, including 121,855 residential buildings, 3,047 educational and 738 medical institutions, 537 cultural and 172 religious buildings, and 5,771 water and electricity networks. More than 200 schools have been destroyed and over 1,600 schools damaged. It means that 1 in 7 schools in Ukraine have suffered damage, and this has severely limited access to education for children. Mr. President, the window of opportunity for Russia only opens when Ukraine is running out of the weapons required to defend itself. Russia immediately exploits this situation to seize more Ukrainian lands, as witnessed in Avdiivka, and to kill more Ukrainian children, as happened in Odessa. Millions of Ukrainians have lost their relatives and friends since the beginning of the Russian aggression. All of them were killed by Russia. At this very moment, while we are meeting in this chamber, Russia continues to kill Ukrainians on the territory of Ukraine. And it is important to remember that Russia is not just a big stain on the world's political map. Russia has a face, and it is not just the face of Putin, a murderous dictator who is about to reappoint himself this month. It is also the face of his representatives in this chamber. For millions of people, this face embodies those who killed their loved ones. That is how these faces will be in all history books. The face of a person who continues monotonously and day by day to spread torrents of lies, and not only at Ukraine-related meetings. And I'm not addressing my intervention to Putin's envoy. It is absolutely futile. I address this statement to the legitimate members of the Security Council. The conclusions are clear. The defending party should receive adequate support in exercising its inherent right to self-defense under the Article 51 of the UN Charter. As for the aggressor, the international community should maintain pressure in order to ensure adherence to the path charted by the Ukraine's peace formula and the Anger Resolution of February 2023, principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. The representative of Russia thought that this occasion today was funny enough to share with us a joke. When a clown enters a palace, he said, the clown doesn't become king, the palace becomes a circus. Remarkably, the irony of the fact that the only one who entered Ukraine, and by force, for that matter, is President Putin and Russia, escaped the Russian representative. The fact remains, however, that Russia's aggression is not a laughing matter. Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia, and the FTA country Liechtenstein, member of the European Economic Area, as well as Andorra, Monaco and San Marino, aligned themselves with this statement. President, when the UN Secretary General visited Kiev in 2022, Russian missiles hit the city. When a delegation of African leaders traveled to Ukraine on a peace mission last year, Russia again struck. And on Wednesday, when the Greek Prime Minister joined Ukrainian President Zelensky in Odessa to pay tribute to the victims of the Russian drone strike, of which many were children, Russia once again carried out air attacks which struck perilously close to the two leaders. For over 2 years now, the Ukrainian people have endured such attacks on a daily basis. The EU reiterates its resolute condemnation of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression, which constitutes a manifest violation of international law, including the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly. Russia's systematic airstrikes against civilian objects and critical infrastructure in Ukraine are unacceptable and must stop. Such intentional attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure add to the growing evidence of war crimes, as reported by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression against Ukraine and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by the war. We reiterate our support for the work of the International Criminal Court and condemned Russia's continued attempts to undermine its independence, international mandate, and functioning. Earlier this week, the ICC issued arrest warrants against 2 Russian military officers, Sergei Ivanovich Kobylash and Viktor Nikolaevich Sokolov, for alleged war crimes of directing attacks against civilian objects and civilians. We also recall the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice of March 22 for Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. All of us must keep reaffirming at every opportunity, and decidedly when Russia bombs and threatens civilians, our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as its inherent right to defend itself. Mr. President, in a few days, Russia will hold elections in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It has already started, in fact, to do so in some areas on the 25th of February, with mail voting. Russia has no legitimate basis for any such action on the territory of Ukraine. We unequivocally condemn and reject Russia's illegal annexation attempts of Crimea and Sevastopol and parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. We urge all UN member states to do the same, in line with the UN Charter and the GA resolutions adopted by an overwhelming majority of member states. The path to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is for the aggressor to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the decision of the General Assembly, and to stop at once its continued and brutal bombing of the country and its people. Mr. President, in closing, the European Union will continue its global outreach to ensure the widest possible international support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, and the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula, with a view to a global peace summit. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and many thanks also to ASG Chiari and Director Doughton for the briefings. Greece aligned itself with the statement just delivered by the European Union, and I would like to make the following comments in my national capacity. On March 6, Russia launched an aerial attack on Ukraine's Black Sea city of Odessa, while Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Zelensky were visiting the city's port. The blast occurred just a few hundred meters away from the leader's motorcade. There was no time to go to a shelter. Fortunately, neither was hurt, and despite the explosion, they continued with their scheduled program in Odessa, a city of particular historical and cultural importance for Greece. Unfortunately, this very Russian strike caused the death of 5 people. A couple of days before, Russia has launched yet another drone attack on Odessa, hitting a multi-story residential building, killing 12 civilians, including 5 children. Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Zelensky visited together the damaged housing complex and laid flowers at the memorial in honor of these innocent victims. Greece condemns in the strongest possible terms the deliberate attacks on civilians, especially women and children, and civilian infrastructure committed in Ukraine in the context of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression. All attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop immediately. They are prohibited under international law and are simply unacceptable for a moral as well as humanitarian point of view. Prime Minister Mitsotakis' visit in Odessa was organized to show solidarity with the Ukrainian people who are fighting for their freedom and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country, and to demonstrate Greece's continuous and solid support for Ukraine. Greece reiterates its resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter, and reaffirms the unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and its inherent right of self-defense against the Russian aggression. Greece confirms a steadfast commitment to continue to provide strong political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. As a position of principle, my country condemns in the strongest terms any breach of international peace and security effected through military action by any state against the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of another state. It is impossible in this respect to not see the correlation between Ukraine and Cyprus, whose people is still suffering from the consequences of foreign aggression and invasion. It is impossible to not display the same solidarity in both cases. Greece stands ready to continue to contribute to Ukraine's resilience through northern Greece's port, offering the port of Alexandroupolis as a hub for the dispatch of aid through the involvement of the significant Greek merchant fleet in transporting goods, foodstuff and energy resources. Greece supported the establishment of the EU-Ukraine facility and remains committed to assisting Ukraine as regards its reconstruction efforts, organizing towards this end an international conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine on the 15th of February in Athens with a wide participation. I wish to highlight the importance we attach to the Odessa region, also by exploring ways to contribute to the restoration of the city's historical center as one of UNESCO's sites of cultural heritage. Mr. President, Greece supports Ukraine's initiative for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Along with our partners, we will continue working with Ukraine on its peace formula, including on ensuring the widest possible international support for its key principles and objectives. Mr. President, before closing, let me highlight that Greece, in its current capacity, and hopefully as a future elected member of the UNSC, will continue to stand against any illegal use of force in international relations in flagrant violation of the basic principles of the UN Charter. We will continue to advocate for respect for international law and justice, as well as for safeguarding the principles of territorial integrity and inviolability of borders, national sovereignty, and freedom of navigation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Poland aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We thank Japan for convening this meeting, prompted by the barbaric Russian attacks on the city of Odessa, conducted on the 2nd and on the 6th of March. We reiterate our strongest condemnation of Russia's illegal, unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression that constitute a blatant violation of UN Charter and international law. We also pay tribute to the thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including hundreds of children, who have lost their lives due to Russia's pursuit of its neo-imperial and neo-colonial ambitions. Mr. President, less than a week ago, on March 2nd, Russia conducted the drone attack on a residential building in Odessa, the deadliest incident in months. And on the 6th, it nearly reached the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece, by far not the first foreign dignitary who had to seek shelter against Russian attack during an official visit to Ukraine. This adds to the long list of war crimes committed against the civilian population by Russian Federation since the very first day of the full-scale aggression against Ukraine. Such attacks are used by Russia as a tool of war, with complete disregard for the protection of civilians and international humanitarian law. The state that is determined to crush another sovereign country in order to reassure itself of its own power must be stopped. Over the last 2 years, the Ukrainians are tirelessly defending their territory, their homes, their lives, and their dignity. But what should the international community do? Should we allow ourselves to be intimidated by the aggressor, or should we support the victim in its desperate but heroic fight? Russia won't stop until it is stopped. Russian economy switched into war mode. Around 30% of budget is designed to cover military expenses. Freezing the war will not bring back the stability. It would only give Russia time to recover and continue its imperial and aggressive policy. Our inactivity, indolence, indifference will only encourage violence. We must therefore continue to provide concrete assistance to Ukraine. This is the only way to stop the aggression. The attacks in Odessa remind us that we cannot grow tired of the war against Ukraine. We must also bring to justice those responsible for these heinous crimes, or else we risk constant repetition of similar acts of violence around the world. Poland welcomes the issuance of new arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court against 2 high-ranking Russian commanders, General Sergei Kobylazh and Admiral Viktor Sokolov, for their alleged responsibility for the war crimes of directing attacks on civilian objects and civilians. Mr. President, on the International Women's Day, let me commend incredible bravery, resilience, and determination of the women of Ukraine. They refuse to give up and are relentless in their work and fight for a better future for their country, at a time when they are caught up in a war waged with total disregard for human life and dignity. International community should remain committed in supporting them and ensuring that they have a leading role in Ukraine's economic and social recovery. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union and a few more remarks. I thank today's briefers for their briefings. Russia's brutal war has claimed countless lives of innocent Ukrainians. It continues to cause enormous human suffering and destruction. Attacks on the Ukrainian port city Odessa carried out by Russia on 2nd of March and 6th of March is clear evidence of deliberately targeting civilians and critical infrastructure of Ukraine, constituting yet another blatant violation of the international law, including the UN Charter. At least 12 civilians, including 5 children, were killed by Russian drone that hit apartment block. Another missile launched to Odessa fell dangerously close to Greek Prime Minister and Ukraine President during their visit to the city. It killed 5 civilians and caused destruction of the port-related facilities. Odessa, as a key port city of Ukraine, plays a crucial role in shipments of food supplies to global south countries. More than 30 million metric tons of agricultural products have been exported through Odessa port since August 2023 through shipping corridor established by Ukraine after Russia unilaterally withdrew from Black Sea Grain Initiative. By targeting port, Russia does harm global supply chains and food security worldwide. This affects most vulnerable populations and aggravates food shortages. We condemn yet again and again Russia's criminal actions in Ukraine by attacking civilians and critical infrastructure, which constitute a war crime. Russia's full-scale, illegal, unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine is carried out with the complicity of Belarus and military support from Iran and DPRK. We continuously call upon aggressor to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Russia's criminal actions are not compatible with its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Mr. President, accountability is a prerequisite for a lasting and just peace. Russia and its leaders must be held accountable for the crime of aggression through a fully fledged international tribunal that enjoys broad support and legitimacy by the international community. In this regard, we welcome the recent ICC arrest warrants for 2 Russian officers for their crimes committed in Ukraine. Just and sustainable peace cannot be achieved at Ukraine's expense. Any half solutions or any Russian gains from the war will just encourage further aggression. We support Ukraine's peace initiative and encourage other members of the United Nations to join it. Baltic states reaffirm our full solidarity with Ukraine and unwavering support until its victory. And on this International Women's Day, let us spare thought for all women killed and raped in Ukraine and in other wars. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.